In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. I'm not going to talk directly about today's gospel, which is about the genealogy of Christ's human side. But I do want to just point out one thing. When you hear toward the end, when the evangelist Matthew says, from Abraham until David were 14 generations. And from the time of the exile to Babylon to the return is 14 generations. And from the coming back from the exile to Babylon to the birth of Christ is 14 generations. Why is he stressing 14, 14, 14? Is because before Arabic numerals, almost every language used letters for numbers. We know this for those of you who study Roman numerals verses. Well, the Greeks did the same thing, and in Hebrew they did the same thing. And in Hebrew, they didn't have vowels. They only had consonants, and you would guess at what the vowels were between the consonants. So the way you would spell David in Hebrew is DVD. Not that you play on a machine, but this is David, DVD. D stood for 4, and V stood for 6. So 4 plus 6 plus 4 makes 14. So to a Jewish listener to the Gospel of Matthew, and this is the only one that was originally written in Hebrew, he's talking to his Semitic brothers and sisters that don't you see, Christ is the son of David, 3 times over. David, David, David. So I would just share that one thought with you about the gospel reading. What I really would like to talk about this morning is an article that appeared in Time magazine, believe it or not, written by a professor of New Testament and early Christianity at the University of St. Andrews and a senior research fellow at Wycliffe Hall at Oxford University. He's the author of over 80 books, and he's a very, very respected scholar. And one of his most famous books is The New Testament in Its World. And he wrote a most interesting article, and the title of it was, The New Testament Doesn't Say What Most People Think It Does About Heaven. Now, what does he mean by that? Now, remember, he's a Westerner, and he's writing in Oxford. One of the central stories of the Bible, many people believe, is that there is a heaven and an earth, and that human souls have somehow been exiled from heaven and are serving out their time here on earth until they can return to heaven. This concept of going to heaven. Indeed, for most modern Christians in the West, the idea of going to heaven when you die is not simply one belief among others, but it's one that seems to give a point to it all. But the people who believed in that kind of heaven when the New Testament was written were not the early Christians. This is a foreign concept for them. That's not how heaven works. They were the Middle Platonists. They were actually Greek philosophers. Like people like Plutarch, who was a younger contemporary of St. Paul, the Apostle, who was a philosopher, a biographer, an essayist, and a pagan priest at Delphi. He believed this, that souls would go to heaven. But to understand what the first followers of Jesus believed about what happens after death, we need to read the New Testament in its own world, the world of Jewish hope, of Roman imperialism, and of Greek thought and philosophy. Because the way the early Christians thought about heaven is exactly the way the Orthodox Church thinks about heaven. And it's very different from Western Christianity. The followers of the Jesus movement in that first generation, who grew up in that complex environment, saw heaven and earth, God's space and our space, if you will, as twin halves of God's good creation. Rather than rescuing people from this world in order to reach heaven, the other world, they believed the Creator God would finally bring heaven and earth together in a great act of new creation, completing the original creative purpose by healing the entire cosmos of its ancient ills. When I first met Father Theodore as a teenager and discovered the Orthodox Church, our Archimandrite Theodore of blessed memory, the first abbot of this monastery, 50 years ago, I remember something he told me. He said, to understand how different Orthodoxy is from the rest of Christianity, just consider architecture. Orthodox churches always have domes, or at least the ideal Orthodox structure has domes. But in the West, what do you see? You see church steeples and spires. There were no spires or steeples, even in the West, until after the Great Schism, when the West broke away from the Orthodox Church. It shows up with Gothic architecture. Romanesque architecture had domes, just like Orthodox churches in the East, the Mediterranean. So what does this signify when we have domes in Orthodox churches and Romanesque churches when the West was still Orthodox, and spires only appearing in the West after the schism and the rise of Gothic architecture? One of the earliest spires to show up was the Cathedral at Chartres in France. It's 12th century. And it's very famous, it's very beautiful, but it's something new. It's an innovation to have spires instead of domes. But spires emphasize this latter concept of rescuing people from this world and going up to heaven, to somewhere else. Some of these spires in the late Middle Ages would get 400 feet high, 200 meters high even. They were huge. If you've been to Germany and France, you'll see these. But it's new. It wasn't there in the ancient church. It wasn't there even when the West, for the first 1,000 years, when they had Romanesque architecture. So the domes emphasize the early Christian and Orthodox concept of a creator God, finally bringing heaven and earth together, descending to us. In the Lord's Prayer, don't we say, thy kingdom come? May your kingdom come. Not may we go to your kingdom. May your kingdom come here to sanctify us. The early Christians in Orthodox Christianity, which has preserved the same perspective, believed that God would then raise his people from the dead and share in, and indeed share his stewardship over this rescued and renewed, transfigured cosmos. And they believed all of this because of the message of Jesus Christ. The early Christians believed that with the conception, the birth, and the resurrection of Jesus, this new creation has already been launched. His kingdom has a foothold in this world. It's the church, where we see the sacramental grace. He's present here with us this morning. As many of you who received Holy Communion have the kingdom of God within you. How long you keep it is up to you and your behavior and whether you stay close to God. If you fall from grace, you need to come back. And we all do. We all trip and stumble. But Jesus embodied in himself this perfect fusion of heaven and earth. That's what's happened. Christmas is more than a story of a cute baby, a boy being born in a manger. I mean, this is God becoming man. The church father said, God became man so that man might become God. It's a union of God and man, of our space and God's space. And it all happens in the person of Jesus Christ and everyone who is one with him through baptism and Holy Communion. We all are part of his birth. We all are part of his resurrection. We share in this union between God and man. This is what's happening. Heaven descending to us and God coming to us. The point was not for us to go to heaven, but for the life of heaven to arrive on earth. As I said, Jesus embodied in himself this perfect fusion of heaven and earth. And Jesus, the ancient Jewish hope, had at last come true. And Jesus taught his followers to pray, as I said, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. From as early as the 3rd century, though, some Christian writers are trying to blend this early Christian concept with some systems of Platonic belief, generating this idea of leaving earth and going to heaven, which became mainstream thinking by the later Middle Ages in the West. But Jesus' first followers in Orthodox Christianity never took that route. Israel's scriptures had long promised that God would come back in person to dwell with his people forever. The early Christians picked this up. In the Gospel of John, the Word became flesh, became incarnate, says John, and dwelt in our midst. But even more dramatically, the word isn't to just dwell. It's something far stronger and more poignant. The word for dwelt in the Greek actually is, he came here to tabernacle among us, which means to pitch his tent. He came to pitch his tent and dwell among us and be one of us so that we might be one with him. And this alludes to the wilderness tabernacle at the time of Moses and the temple built by Solomon. If we study the New Testament historically in its own world and not in 21st century secular modern times, if we study it in the context of the early Christians, as opposed to squashing and chopping it to fit our own modernist Western expectations, it shows that the first Christians believed not that they would go to heaven when they died, but that Jesus, God, had come to live with them and in them. As Christ said, the kingdom of heaven is within you. That was the lens through which they saw the hope of the world. The book of Revelations at the end of the New Testament doesn't end with souls going up to heaven, but with the new Jerusalem coming down to earth. So that the dwelling of God is with us. The whole creation, says St. Paul, will be set free from its bondage to death and corruption to enjoy God's intended freedom. God will then be all in all, and only what is part of God will remain. It's hard for us moderns in the West to grasp this concept because so many hymns and prayers and sermons in Western Christianity still speak of going to heaven. But you won't find that in the Orthodox Church. It's not there. Our hymns are about something very, very different, like the early Christians. So their view makes historical sense, and it sheds light on everything else. So what then was this personal hope for Jesus' followers? Ultimately, resurrection. A new and immortal physical body in God's new creation. But after death and before that final reality, a period of blissful rest. St. Paul, well, actually Christ on the cross, when he turned to the good thief, he says, "You will be with me this day in paradise." And again, Christ assures his followers, "In my Father's house are many mansions." That's really a mistranslation. What it really means is, in my Father's palace, there are many chambers, many rooms for you to be at rest until the consummation of the universe, the transfiguration of the cosmos. And St. Paul, when he was awaiting his execution, said, "My desire is to depart to be with the Messiah, which is far better." But he's not talking about going to heaven. He's just talking about being in his Father's house. So this is not the final destination, these chambers, these mansions. They are temporary resting places. Even, you heard me say before, the word cemetery in Greek means dormitory. It's a Christian word. Christians coined that word. It was a sleeping ground for those awaiting the resurrection. It's temporary resting places before the ultimate new creation. So if we read the New Testament historically in its own world, on its own terms, it brings surprises that can have an impact on modern Christianity too. There's this kind of idea that we don't need to take care of this planet because it's all going to be destroyed and we're going to go somewhere else, but go be to heaven. But from this concept, with early Christians and Orthodoxy, this is where it's going to be, here in this cosmos, and this planet. So we have to take care of it and pave the way for this transfigured cosmos. So the world is not just a shipwreck that's going to be jettisoned. It's something that's going to be redeemed and transfigured. And it's already happening within the boundaries of the church. The Christian mission includes bringing real advanced signs of this new creation to be present in the world, in healing, in justice, in beauty, in celebrating the mysteries of the sacraments and our union with God. The Scriptures always promised that when the life of heaven came to earth through the work of Israel's Messiah, the weak and the vulnerable would receive special care and protection, and the desert would blossom like a rose. So care for the poor and the planet becomes a central theme of Christianity, not peripheral. And to those who intend to live in faith and hope by the Spirit between the resurrection of Jesus and the coming renewal of all things. In the hymns for the birth of Christ, for the nativity of Christ, among them is a hymn to his mother for his feast day. It says, "All of creation rejoices in you, O full of grace, the assembly of angels and the race of men, both heaven and earth. O sanctified temple and spiritual paradise, the glory of virgins, from whom God was incarnate and became a child, our God before time. He made your body into a throne, and your womb he made more spacious than the heavens. All of creation rejoices in you, O full of grace. Glory to you." Because with the coming of the God-man Christ, heaven and earth come together, and redemption begins. In the Cantatrium for the feast, we hear, "Today the Virgin gives birth to the transcendent one, the one who transcends creation. And the earth offers a cave to the unapproachable one. Angels with shepherds glorify him, and the wise men journey with the star, since for our sake the eternal God was born as a little child." In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.